All right. Thank you for giving me thanks for the 30-second break. I guess I should thank myself. I'm the one who gave it to me. Um, but we're back now. I hope I didn't interrupt you in any way, Dom,
No?
but I just wanted to give us a quick break. And also, we've got 45 minutes left, folks. I just want to ask the co-hosts and Dom as well, real quick. Do we want to try and touch on the other topics, or do we want to continue with this one?
Well, I mean, I personally can talk about reform all night because I feel very passionate about it and I know how broken and horrible everything is here. But
Right.
I think it would be nice to maybe touch on some of the other things as well.
Yeah, the one that I think it seems to be to interest at least a couple of our regulars was the topic of the EU, which I think kind of combine that with Brexit, maybe.
Yep.
So, really quick, I guess I'll leave this to my co-hosts. What would you like to touch on first, Brexit or the EU?
I love Brexit.
I mean, they kind of go hand in hand, though, right?
That's what I was kind of thinking.
Right.
I mean, they
okay,
really
so let's
do.
start with Brexit and we'll move into the EU.
Okay.
Is that okay with you, Don?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just because it's in our news every day, all day, and because I've lived it, I don't know how much you know about how the EU works or what the EU is, so that might lead into why Brexit happened.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you take it from why don't you take charge?
Yeah.
And lead us down the path that you think best explains both.
Yeah, let's go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me just say really quick before we start, though, you and I had a long discussion about both of these topics. And my feeling, and you illuminated for me that there were actually some benefits to the EU, and that my perspective, which I think is the perspective of many Americans, is kind of that the EU is the brainchild and the dream of Hitler, and that we view that, that's how we see the EU, and we see it as an evil organization that's hell bent on destroying the history and the culture of Europe as an entirety. Or in its entirety. And so that's kind of how we perceive things. But you expressed to me that's not entirely true.
Yeah, the irony is it actually all comes out of the Second World War. So it's kind of the opposite. It was created by those who defeated Hitler in a sense, in a general sense. Mm-hmm. So just a little disclaimer is, yeah, up front, I voted to remain. I'm one of those. But I'm nowhere near as Remainy as a lot of people on my side are. So the EU is flawed, has big flaws. There are reasonable people who, on balance, decide that it has more flaws than benefits, either in principle or just because it's flawed in practice. They're not racist, those people. They're not crazy. I share many of their concerns. It's a complicated system with 500 million people. And so I'll say up front that, yeah, I came down on balance on Remain, but I can understand and sympathise with many people who voted to leave, just to get that out of the way. Okay, so won't take too long with this, but just a minute or two, just briefly, what is the EU? It's very fucking complicated. Really quickly, it kind of goes to, well, there was a thing in 1950 which was started with the support of Churchill and all the major world leaders who were involved in the Second World War. The idea was, look, we need to have better trading between all these countries in Europe because that will help avoid a European war. And we've had 2 of those already, and there was plenty of those throughout previous histories. Europe just loves going to war with itself. It can't stop going to war, and peace treaties are good, but not as good as good trading arrangements that help stop war. And so they started the European Coal and Steel Community, which was Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And for quite a few... Yeah, go on.
There's only 27 countries in the EU currently.
Yeah, it started with just a couple of them trading coal and steel, and the UK wasn't actually allowed in. The guy who was running it was a French guy, and he said, "Your economy is different to ours. We'll keep it on the continent." Because the UK isn't really part of Europe. It's not on the continent. It's its own island. So originally they weren't allowed in.
Can you say that again?
So the UK, although you guys might say, "Oh, we're Europe," we're not Europe. We're part of the EU, but we're not on the continent of Europe.
Right, you're not the mainland. You're a big old island off on your own.
Yeah, so we didn't join at first. It wasn't even called the EU. It was just the European Coal and Steel Community throughout the 50s. Then they established a common market. And then only in 1973 was the UK actually allowed in, even though we'd had people to help set it up and do some of the treaties, and Churchill was in favour of it. We weren't in it ourselves until the 70s. And then...
Now, I'm sorry, just to interrupt real quick. I want to make sure I understand the primary purpose initially, and even still, if I understand you correctly, was trade and freedom of movement.
Not yet. So at this point, throughout the 50s and 60s, it was mainly just trade, because the idea is if you have a group of countries that are heavily involved in trading with each other, they're not going to go to war. Because how are they going to... Yeah, and that is on the right and the left pretty much agreed upon broadly. If you have good trade, you might have some arguments, but you're not going to go and invade each other if your trade is good. In the modern world, it's only when you have one group trading and another group trading, those groups go to war. So within the group, you're not going to get a war. And so throughout the 50s and the 60s, it was just trading, and it worked really, really well. If you look at the GDP,
is that the goal? I'm sorry, real quick. Is that the goal then? Is the idea that the more European countries they get to join the EU, the less likely there is to be a war between those countries then?
Well, it's changed now. This is why people voted.
That's how it was.
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons people voted to leave, which I can understand, is that it's not just about trade anymore. So initially it was about trade. The UK joined in the early 70s. And then over the years, they actually 2 years later had a referendum. Do we want to stay in this thing or not? Because it's moving towards more than just trade. Although, to be fair, when they made it, they didn't say this is only ever going to be about trade. The idea was, in its inception, it's about trade, but it's actually about bringing Europe closer together, and we're going to add more. They said that at the start, but we didn't really know where that was going to go. So we joined as thing was growing throughout the 70s. And then some of Southern Europe joined over the 80s, and then in the 90s and 2000s, the post-Soviet countries started joining. Along the way, there were different treaties as it got kind of rejigged and reorganized, and the rules got changed. They'd all vote and make the Treaty of Maastricht or the Treaty of Lisbon. And so eventually, in the early 2000s, a lot of countries joined all at once, like loads. And that's where you get to the big number it is today. And the last treaty that was done, the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, that gave more power to the European Parliament. So it made it, because up until then it wasn't that democratic. It still isn't that democratic, but you've got to compare it to other democracies.
Right. What do you mean by it's not that democratic?
Okay, so here's how it works, and this is where it gets incredibly messy. So get your thinking hats on. Yeah. So the EU, bear in mind that you have to compare this to the way other democracies work, and it's no democracy with a few exceptions, no democracy is direct democracy. We vote people to vote on our behalf, who vote on the behalf of other things.
Yeah, it's a republic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Representative democracy.
So there are different kinds of doing that. And obviously, it's going to be more complicated because it's made of different countries with their own interests and their own systems. So how it works is you have an EU Council, you have an EU Parliament, you have the EU Commission, and then confusingly, you also have the Council of the EU, which is different to the EU Council.
So there's an EU Council and a Council of the EU, and those are two separate entities?
Yes, and there are other things that sound like them that are nothing to do with the EU, but that's another conversation.
What the fuck? All right.
Yeah, it gets really complicated. The point of all this is that you can't just have one group of people making decisions, because that would be so easy to rig, because you'd find a way to get your one representative to represent only a certain part of the country's interests. And then, so they purposely make it so that there's so many checks and balances and so many complexities involved that it's almost impossible to get a lot of people to agree on what should be done. But when they do agree, the idea is that's some form of democracy. Now, admittedly, some people will say, well, this one bit over here has too much power, so it's not really checks and balances. But, it's up to interpretation. So the EU Council. So the EU Council, that represents national governments. So it's made of state leaders, and sometimes they bring along cabinet members, but it's high-ranking government. So
these are representatives of the 27 countries.
Yeah, well, there will be 27, but at the moment 28. But yeah, once we've gone, it'll be 27. And so the idea is that they are representing the nations involved. They all get together every so often. I don't know how, and they basically set out, here's our agenda going forward. Here's what we all agree the EU should do. Because the EU, it's not like the UN in terms of peacekeeping and just agreeing no one argues. The idea is you have a common purpose you need to move towards to help the EU. We all should be pro-EU if you're in the EU and want the best for the EU. I'm going to be saying EU a lot.
Fair.
So the idea is that each of the nations represented, the state leaders go there, and that's the EU Council. And they don't propose like laws or anything. They just set out the agenda, the high level stuff. They are involved in if there's big restructuring, but they're not actually running the things. So that's the EU Council. The EU Parliament, this is where it's really a bit more messy. That's made up of members of the European Parliament called MEPs. And they're
okay, so is this what we keep seeing video clips of over here? Is that the European Parliament then?
If you ever see clips of people standing up and arguing in a huge room of people or with earpieces,
like Nigel Farage.
Yeah, they're in the European Parliament. Yeah, and it's a parliamentary system. So the weird thing is those people are elected from parties. So they don't represent nation states like the EU Council. They represent political parties. So
can I stop you real quick? I want to take a brief pause in what we're talking about. You just reminded me of something that was news to me, and I know it's a little off topic, but it goes along with what you were just saying. You don't vote in Britain for your prime minister.
Correct.
I didn't really understand that until you had explained it to me, and I found that fascinating. I don't know who else, if everybody else already knows this. Maybe I'm the dumb one who's just catching up. But
yeah, I knew it.
So the way it works for you guys, whereas we vote for our president, you guys don't vote for your prime minister. You vote your local elections. So you have two primary parties. You have other parties too, but there are two primaries, which are the Tories and the Labour Party.
Yep.
And so everybody votes for their local their local party members, whether it be a Labour or a Tory. And once that local election is done, you just add up how many Tory members got voted in and how many Labour members got voted in, and whoever has the majority, that party picks somebody out of their party to represent their party as the prime minister.
Yes, and as Ray just said in the chat, it is possible for the person who ends up being a prime minister to not get elected in their own district, because all they have to be is the leader of the party who wins.
So they can lose their local election, but as long as the majority of their party members got elected, they'll still end up as prime minister.
I think so. It is rare if that does happen, but there's loads of weird loopholes and clauses in our system because it's based on a system that doesn't have a foundation. It's just based on its own loopholes. So yeah,
right. I wanted to clarify that. I thought that was such an interesting bit of trivia. Well,
yeah. So basically, the only people who, so Theresa May is our prime minister. The only people in the country who have her on a ballot paper are in her local district. So she's just a politician like anyone else. She personally has not like she has a load more power. She's not head of state. The Queen's the head of state, so she doesn't have the power to do things unilaterally. It's the government who has the power, not her.
Right.
So yeah, so we vote for our local representatives, and you add them all up, and their seats in the parliament, and you have to get a majority. And if you don't, multiple minor parties can group up together, and if together they have a majority, they run the.
Yeah, that's a little different than ours. And TC Boggs mentioned it's a different version of our electoral college system. I would argue that's not really even. I wouldn't even say that that's correct, because our electoral college system works differently even than that, because it's still there's still a vote for our president. It's
kind of
not
like they work as a middleman. Like your electoral college use the votes of the citizens and vote on their behalf. So the votes don't go towards dictating the president. The electoral college votes do, but they vote based on the votes of the citizens. So it's like there's a middleman to even it out. That's what I was going to say.
It's very rare. I mean, it can happen that an electoral college member can vote against what their state voted, but it's rare. It doesn't really happen very often. So, but back to the EU. I'm sorry for interrupting.
That's all right. So far we've got the EU Council, which is the national governments, the heads of state, just dictating what they want, and they form a policy agenda. Then the EU Parliament, which is made of MEPs, and they're political party members. So just like how in my country we have the Conservatives, nicknamed the Tories, and we have Labour and Liberal Democrats, etc., who stand in our British Parliament, we also have Conservative MEPs and Labour MEPs and Liberal Democrat MEPs, and they sit in the European Parliament. And all of the countries do this, and yes, and there's UKIP as well. And all of the countries do this within each of their countries, and they hold elections in their countries for who's going to represent those parties in the European Parliament. And so the European Parliament is huge, and it's organised into political parties, and the number of MEPs from each country depends on their population, roughly. Some get off better than others in this. Like Luxembourg do pretty well. So it's similar to.
I'm gonna stop you real quick. I want to just pause for a brief moment. Armageddon, you asked, what about UKIP? If you could specify what you're asking, what about it? Carry on, Dominic, if you will.
Yeah. So it's similar, I guess, in terms of, you know how your House of Representatives, you get more if you're a big state and then less if you're not, so that it's proportional to the size or the population of the states. That's kind of how it's done here. So a small, tiny country in the EU has just a couple of MEPs, and the big ones have more. But you could have
I think
But-
TC Box is correct in that it's like our House of Representatives.
Yeah, it is. It's population.
That's what he said.
I didn't hear you.
Yeah, he literally
my
just made
mistake.
that
I didn't hear you.
comparison.
I missed it. I must have been reading.
It's like, you know how you have your House of Representatives, where it's based on population, and then you're like, I think TC Boggs in chat is correct that it's like the House of Representatives.
I'm sorry, Dominic. I didn't mean to take that away from you. I think you're probably saying it at the same time I was reading it, and I'm not good at multitasking. So, Armageddon asked, where does UKIP stand ideologically compared to the many parties in the UK?
Okay. Well, just as a quick thing, obviously, I don't vote UKIP, so any UKIP supporters hearing this are probably going to think I've completely fucked it up. But to steel man them, to give my best version, UKIP is on the right, so they are right of centre, more libertarian. They're kind of more old school conservative. They don't like that the Conservatives now seem too flimsy and too willing to move over towards the left and have lost their principles. So they are trying to revert back to that. They don't like the idea of, they're called the United Kingdom Independence Party, which kind of makes me giggle a bit because we are independent. But in their eyes, we're not independent because we're curtailing to the EU. They're ruling over us like some sort of international nation state. So right, yeah,
that's how a good many of us here see the EU, like an overlord. And I think when you and I were discussing it, while you were explaining what the EU was, I had come to a point where I made an observation where I felt like the European countries themselves were similar to the independent states that we have, and the EU is kind of, in a sense, like our federal government,
almost,
but has more control than we allow our federal government to have. We were talking about how our federal government, we try and keep them out of our states' rights and our states' business as much as possible, and use them only in a manner of sort of like a referee, where, you know, when states can't come to an agreement on something that affects everyone state to state, the federal government is, ideally, this is how it's supposed to work, I think. That's when the federal government is supposed to come in and kind of referee a decision. And other than that, they just kind of take care of the borders and keep us defended and safe from harm. And that's about all that they're supposed to be doing. Whereas your EU goes beyond that.
I think it's the closest analogy that people can bring to mind. So I get why you'd use that analogy, but there are some big differences. So, for example, I don't think the EU has more power because you still do have separate countries. Countries can form their own laws in ways that your states couldn't. And the purpose makes a big difference as well. So the purpose of your federal government is to make sure the United States stay united. They have their own cultures within the states, but they're still American. And like you say, it's to sort out disputes.
Right. Right. That is a major difference. We all have that one common ground, is all the states are American states.
Yeah. And I guess that's why people voted to leave, or people are critical of the EU, is because they felt that the EU supranational government was trying to make the EU into one nation, which I can sympathise with. I can see how that looked like that. But so yeah, the next bit of the EU I was going to come on to is the bit that everyone hates. Everyone who wants to leave points to this. It's the EU Commission.
Okay.
So far we've got the Council representing the nations, the Parliament representing the parties within each country. And by the way, those parties often group together. So you might have the liberals from each of the nations grouping to form an alliance of liberals, and the same with the conservatives. You know, so that's how, because there's over like 700 of them, so there's loads in the Parliament. So the Commission is made up of, they're basically EU staff, and they ensure the running of the EU. So they are the ones who propose new laws. They are the ones who check that the laws are being adhered to. They do all the bureaucracy, the paperwork. They keep track of things. So they do the day-to-day running. And the way that they get elected is a bit confusing. People from the EU Council propose them. Well, it's basically it's the Council of the EU, which is another one I haven't come on to yet. They propose them. They put them forward. I know, it's so confusing, isn't it? They put them forward, and then they're confirmed by the EU Parliament. The EU Parliament.
It does feel a little bit like you guys do it on purpose. It feels like, why the fuck does it have to be this goddamn complicated? This is a little confusing.
Well, I'll tell you why. It's because, like I say, it depends how you view it. Some people would say this is the very reason it's totalitarian. It's done this. It's almost Kafkaesque. It's done this on purpose so that there's no way. So that if ever you say it's totalitarian, someone can come back and say, but there's this check and this balance, and they do it on purpose. But the reverse, you could also say, from the other point of view, you could say, yeah, well, it's done that so that there can't be one person or one group in power. There are always others
to prevent a centralization of power.
Yes. So it really depends on how you see it already. And
right. The overcomplicated nature is meant to act as the checks and balances.
Yeah, and you've also got to understand that it's going to be complicated. It's representing over 507 million people with different cultures, with different systems, different politics, different histories. So there is no one system that they could possibly use that they get everyone to agree to. And to be honest, it's amazing that they've agreed to this much so far. They've managed to keep it going.
Right.
So I'm almost done with how it works. So you've got the nations, the parliament, the EU Commission, and that's the bit everyone hates because they propose the new. They're the ones, and they decide which I've just seen someone say war, and I said wars. They decide which laws to propose by looking at the agenda that the council set. So that council who is setting the agenda, the policy that we want to do, they look at that and they draft up new laws, and that then goes through the EU Parliament. Has to be voted on by the EU Parliament, and then it goes to this fourth place. So the Council of the EU. It's confusing. I don't know why the fuck they called it. So it's often just called the Council. That's made up of ministers. So specific ministers for different sectors. So it has different configurations. So it morphs depending on what's going to be discussed. So let's say it's something financial. So then it will morph and it will become the Economic and Financial Affairs Council. The relevant ministers will attend, the finance ministers from all the countries. And if it's the Agricultural and Fisheries Council, then the Secretary of State for Environment and Food will attend. So that's how it works. This is to protect the national interests for each member state. So after the law has been drafted and then gone through the EU Parliament, it then has to pass through here. And they have the final say. So then it's almost done. Then a law, what happens is the EU Commission, who drafted the law, they look at it, the amendments that might have been made by the Parliament, they look at the amendments and changes, and they either give a negative or a positive opinion on the law as it now stands, just before it's finalised. And if the EU Commission gives a negative opinion on the EU law, the Parliament have changed. The Council, the one I've just described, the Council of Ministers, has to be unanimous in order for it to pass. So if one of them don't like it, it does not become law.
Right. So no law that affects all of the states, or I'm sorry, the countries involved in the EU if they want to pass something that's supposed to affect everyone, it has to be a unanimous vote that everyone agrees on. If even one of those countries says, no, I don't agree on this, it doesn't pass and it doesn't affect anybody. Is that correct?
Almost. It'd be great if it was like that, but that's only if the EU Commission gives a negative opinion on the law as it now stands after it's gone through the EU Parliament. So if the EU Commission gives a positive opinion on the amendments, then the Council has to reach a 55% threshold to pass it.
Oh, okay. I get you.
So basically,
I'm sorry. I'm gonna put a pause on this real quick, only because we have just under 15 minutes left. I want to bring it to a point where anyone in the audience and any of the co-hosts, I'd like to open the floor to questions that they might have based on everything we talked about so far. I'd like to start it off, if I could, by asking a question I saw that was also mentioned in the chat earlier, about the possibility of an EU military, like an EU army.
I knew that was going to come up. I knew that was going to
Right. That was something that you and I discussed, and you explained to me that was not really possible. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so what would have to happen is, so that wouldn't be able to happen under the current way it's set out. They'd have to ask for a new treaty, or, I mean, people are saying it's the next logical thing they might want to do. Well, they can want to do it all they want, but they can't with the way it's set up. So even if you have video clips of people saying we need an EU army, it's the equivalent of if some House of Representatives guy stood up and made some crazy claim about reorganizing the entire army. You guys would go, yeah, great, but it's not going to happen because we know what needs to happen. So they would have to make some changes to the rules with a new treaty, and that would have to be agreed with unanimous opinion by all the countries. We could veto it. We just veto it.
So there's no way for that that kind of change or decision to be made under that one rule that you talked about, where they only need 55% approval?
Well, no, because that's within the powers by the treaties, by the laws. So at the moment, they vote on things like agricultural laws or trading or workers' rights. You know, what can you force a worker to do? How many hours to make them a week? Things like that. The boring shit, basically. If
right,
it was,
so you're saying that there's no way for them to even bring it to a vote? Something like a military?
Yeah, but it depends. What do you mean by military? Because, like, for example,
you know how the UN has an army? I think that's kind of how, at least that's how I would view it, like an EU military or an EU army that would be comprised of enlisted members from all the countries involved in the EU.
Yeah, but the UN, I wouldn't really call the UN an army. They have peacekeepers. They don't. It's not like they have tanks and shit, is it? You know,
they don't have tanks. I thought they had tanks. Is it just APCs?
What? So you just send in the UN army to go and intervene in countries? It's countries that intervene in countries. This is what I'm saying. Is it sounds silly to a lot of our ears when people talk about an EU army. Here's me trying to steel man it. Here's my most charitable view I can give on that. If you mean that there would be a provision put forward so that the EU member states have to collate their armies to work on certain missions, like, I don't even know how that would go down. How would that work? I mean, it's not. It's.
Is that so far-fetched to think of? Like the idea of different countries' military forces working in conjunction on something? I mean,
but
isn't that what we did on D-Day?
Well, but my point is, if all you're really saying is military should work together, well, yeah, duh, everyone does that already. Is that an answer? So what are you saying? If you're saying EU army, you clearly are implying, not you personally, but people who say this would be implying there was an actual army that had, like, the EU flag flying and that had its own tanks and its own standing army in a sense, and that wouldn't go through under. So that's outside the remit of the things they can currently make laws about. All they can do at the moment is agree to work together.
Okay.
Which is just an extension of what we already do. I mean, if a country is making an intervention, other countries work with them, but they are not obliged to do so.
Okay. I'd like to open the floor to any of my co-hosts. If any of you have any questions for Dominic, I see somebody is asking, Sarbamba's asking, who's this guest speaker? Tonight's guest speaker is Dominic West. He's a group member who I brought over. He's a student over in Britain. What are you studying?
I'm actually studying neuroscience and cognitive science.
That's phenomenal.
So that's my expertise, not politics.
That makes. I mean, you're a hell of a lot smarter than me. I can tell that.
Probably not.
No, I'm positive of it.
I'm book smart. My common sense is lacking. I'm book smart.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that, though. That's a lot of people aren't book smart that really should be. So, anyway, again, if anybody has any questions for Dominic, mostly what we've been discussing is the EU, Brexit, and earlier we were discussing crime and punishment reform, really. So, co-hosts, you guys first. Anybody got a question?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So, what, in your view, for me, I thought that Brexit was brought to a head because of the mass refugee crisis that occurred in Europe. And so, what, in your view, is that what brought it to the head, or was it something else?
Oh, good question. I think people may have been looking over at Europe because we wouldn't consider ourselves Europe here. We consider ourselves
right. Sorry about that.
I don't know. Just clarifying. So people might have been looking from here over at mainland Europe and be worried that would happen to us. That may have been part of the reason, but it wasn't actually happening to us. So the shores that the boats were arriving at weren't UK shores. So it may have been they were worried they would end up all coming over or something. To be honest, in terms of immigration, the main problem was immigration, not refugees. So it was legal immigration, and that was a problem. Yeah, I can't deny that. I think any Remain person who tries to deny that is kidding themselves, that there was an issue with immigration. Although that would, to be honest, the fault lies with our own government, not the EU for that.
Right.
So I've got, because I knew that a question like this would come up, so I'm prepared. I've got open in front of me, I've got the official journal of the European Union. It's the newest treaty. It's Article 7, which dictates the right of residence for immigrants.
Before you start, let me just keep in mind for everybody, we've only got a few minutes left before we have to end the show. So just to let everybody know, we've only got a limited amount of time.
Okay, cool. So I'll just list off some things here. Members, if they come over, they have to have sufficient resources for themselves and their family members and not be a burden on the social assistance system of the host member state. They must have comprehensive sickness insurance, so they can't just use the NHS. They can't be a burden on the NHS. They have to have either something they can live off of, or they can have to have a job to come over to. They have to satisfy all of these conditions to be allowed in. Where are we? The right of residence shall not extend, so it shall extend for family members who are not nationals, provided that these union citizens satisfy all the conditions themselves. So there's a lot of conditions.
This is the EU's policy?
Yes. So if people there are issues with immigrants coming over, and there are cultural issues and etc. that I would agree with. But if someone's criticism was to be, oh, well, citizens, refugees or immigrants get in through the shores of Greece or somewhere or Italy, become EU citizens, and then come over and basically rape our social services. That isn't allowed under EU law. So don't blame the EU for doing that. It's as simple as that. It's not the EU, because it's right there in black and white. They're not entitled to that under EU law. So leaving the EU won't change that.
But
so
for refugees,
what was the reason,
that's a different story.
What was the reason for that discrepancy between how these refugees were treated and the EU's official policy on it? Was that a lack of enforcement on the EU's part, or was it a bunch of the countries saying, yeah, we're just going to do our own thing and the EU can sort us out?
It was partly the optics on it. The part of the truth is it really wasn't happening to the extent people thought it was. I'm going to get slated for this in the comments and everything, but like, we really didn't take in many refugees. It's pitiful the amount of refugees we actually took in. Like,
you mean specifically the UK?
Yes, and that's my point, is that we're talking about the UK. So if I was in Germany, I'd be pissed off because they took in like 1 million immigrants and economic migrants and refugees. But that was Germany that decided to do that. So Germans should be angry at their own.
Right. So, and this is a particular point of interest to me. I want to state clearly, I think that the majority of us, at least for myself, I want to say, it was always my understanding that the refugee crisis in Europe was somehow the responsibility of the EU, which you have, in the conversation we had prior, you expressed, like you're doing now, that the EU had nothing to do with that. We're demanding something. Or forcing countries to take in these refugees, making that decision on their own?
Well, no. No. To be fair, the EU does play a part in forcing some countries to take in a certain amount of refugees. My point was that that's not a reason for Brexit. So the UK actually comes off pretty well out of this. So if I was a German, I'd be angry that my country was taking so many. But if as a UK citizen, I haven't got a lot to be angry about in terms of immigration from the EU. There's a bit to be angry about, but not a lot. Not enough for me to vote for Brexit. So, like I say, it's not as open. So we're not in the Schengen area. So there's an area in the EU, which most of the EU is part of, where it's pretty much open borders. The UK is not part of that. So we get our own deal. We can get stricter legislation. Now, the UK government didn't fully enforce all of that. So that's the UK government's fault. Also, it wasn't overall as bad as people were seeing on the TV and everything. There weren't floods of people coming in. There was a lot more people than we would have liked, but
well, we're talking about millions of refugees, aren't we? Millions.
Yeah, but they're not here. They're not here, and they're not all going to allow to.
Okay, right.
And yeah, they could try and sneak in, but then that's my point is, if they're going to circumvent laws and come in hiding on lorries and stuff, how the hell is leaving the EU going to stop that happening? It's not. So in order for that to be a reason to leave the EU, you'd have to be saying it's within the laws of the EU. The laws of the EU are to blame, and by leaving, we'll get rid of those laws. But that's just not the case, at least not with immigration specifically about refugees.
Okay, I'm gonna take a moment real quick. I want to see if my co-hosts want to make a decision on this. Do we want to continue for like an extra 10 minutes, or should we call it here? I'm gonna leave it up to you guys.
Let's push this off because what I would really like to see is to have both you and Paul McGowan on, because that would be very entertaining.
Yeah, it actually really, really would.
Yes,
Dominic, would you be willing to come back next Tuesday and continue this?
Yeah, sure.
Or whenever we can get Paul too. We have to find out from Paul when we can get him.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully, given a week's notice might help, but definitely, I think it would be wonderful to have the two of you involved in the conversation. The only reason we're all intrigued by that is because Paul is also British, but or English, I should say, but very much taking the opposite stance from your own. So it would be interesting to see what points of view or the points you both make given your different positions. Is that something you're agreeable to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to say up front, I probably will agree with him on a lot of things. I would probably just end up saying, yeah, that's a problem bad enough to make me want to leave.
Right. No, I'm sure you would. It's the one thing I can say about you that I learned from our discussion. I went into it when we first got on Discord together and we first started to discuss things. I think I mentioned it to you afterwards. I went in defensively thinking that we were going to be combative, and it turned out that that's not at all how you are. You're a far more agreeable and easy to get along with person than that. So I'm sure it will be a fantastic discussion, and it will be a discussion, not an argument. So I unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I'm going to cut it here. Dominic, I'm so glad that you're willing to come back next Tuesday. We'll try and make it. Well, hopefully we can get Paul to come back too.
We'll just say in a future Tuesday, just to cover our own butts.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll be next week, but we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out as we go. Thank you so much for everyone, to everyone who tuned in tonight. Thank you to my co-hosts. That's going to be it. Be sure to tune in next time. This has been the House of Augur show. JT Augur, good night and go home. Bye, guys.
Night, everybody.
See you.